Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Defiance Silver.
De-dollarisation has gone mainstream, according to our guest, Dominic Frisby. Dominic writes Substack Applying Frisby. Dominic, welcome to Kitco.
Thank you very much for having me, sir.
We're here at Deutsche Goldmesse, but tell us first, why should people hold some gold in their portfolio?
Well, I'm a big believer in the maxim of putting 5 or 10% of your net worth in gold and then hoping it doesn't go up. So that's basically the insurance argument. But so much has been said about gold over the years by so many brilliant minds, and not just in the last 10 or 20 years, but throughout all of history. And so it's very hard to sort of say something original about gold. But I'm going to put forward a philosophical argument as to why everyone should hold some gold. More a philosophical argument than necessarily a financial argument. But I was reading up about how gold gets created. How did gold come to be? And there's some people who think it's divine creation. And then there's a more sort of traditional scientific argument that it happens when through supernovae collision, when stars collide and gold gets created in the nuclear explosions that follow. And in fact, about 3 or 4 years ago, scientists thought they saw gold being created millions and millions of light years away in space when two supernovae collided. But in any case, gold was present in the dust which formed our solar system. And there was all this dust, and the pressure of gravitation and other forces pushed the dust together to form the planets. And gold was present in that dust. Now, if you take that thought and then you think gold is permanent, it doesn't rust, it doesn't tarnish, you can't destroy it. The only way you can destroy gold is through nuclear explosions or by dissolving it in acid, both of which are so rare as to be almost non-existent. So, every speck of gold dust is as it was when the solar system was formed. And therefore, that little bit of gold that you might have around your neck or on your ring, when you're touching that gold, you are coming as close as you will ever come to touching eternity. And I think that's a very profound thought. And in fact, gold has always been, throughout mythology and so on, it's always been associated with the afterlife. The Egyptians thought it was, gold gave you safe passage into the afterlife. The Incas said it was the tears of the sun. They associated it with the heavens. And in fact, today, if you look at gold's applications, industrial applications, a large majority of them are actually at the final frontier. Gold finds a lot of applications, coating spacecraft and so on, because of the fact that it's so permanent. And so there's a sort of philosophical thought for you. And then we go back to Paleolithic man. We'll go into sort of anthropological mode for a second. And people say that gold has been money for 5,000 years. But I would actually say it's been money for probably 10 times longer than that. Because if you go back, the oldest cave that we know of is actually here in Germany called Hol's Cave. And they found among the Stone Age artifacts. So this is when man was still hunter and gathering. He hadn't settled yet. They found gold beads that this Paleolithic man would wear around his neck. And Paleolithic man would come across little gold nuggets as he hunted and gathered in riverbeds. Alluvial gold was much more common then than it is now because most of the easy stuff has since been found. And, gold's relatively easy to shape and so on. And he was using gold to decorate himself as a symbol of status, as a symbol of beauty. He was probably giving it out as reward, maybe bartering a little bit with it. In other words, as a form of very primitive money. He was using that tens of thousands of years before he discovered smelting and the Bronze Age began. So gold was the very, very first metal humans ever used. And there's a great quote from a famous stock trader, Loeb, when he says, "The instinct for gold is the most deep-rooted commercial instinct in the human race." And that instinct, I would argue, goes all the way back to prehistoric times. And so there's a sort of permanence to gold. And as I said, it's like touching eternity. And then you consider not only does gold last, but its purchasing power lasts as well. And that's why it's such a wonderful unit of account, apart from anything else. It's also a brilliant store of wealth. We all know that it buys you as much food, as much clothing, as much energy, as much accommodation, as much housing as it's ever done. And so it's got this wonderful eternal purchasing power. And even though you could say gold no longer really plays a part in the financial system, it does. Because, hundreds of people around the world, thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people around the world use gold as a means to store wealth, to display wealth and to store wealth. And indeed, officials, central banks, we still use gold as a store of wealth. So it does play a role in the financial system, although not the role it once played. But I would argue that gold will still be around a lot longer than humankind will be. And there, in a nutshell, is why you should own gold, because there is a permanence to it that no other substance has.
Dominic, if you're holding gold, what are you insuring yourself against? Why do you have that 5%? What's out there right now?
Well, most assets require some kind of third party in order to realize their value. Your money in the bank, you require trust in the bank. Your bond, your equity, they all require. Gold is a bearer asset. It doesn't, it's nobody else's liability, is the famous saying. And so you're not relying on anyone else. Gold itself is the value. Unless you're storing it in vaults, you're relying on the trustworthiness of the vault provider and so on. But so it's a bearer asset. It's nobody else's liability. And gold tends to do best when trust in the system is low. And you can just feel, even if it's, the culture wars, all the arguments going on social media, all the conflicts, the political conflict, financial crises seem to get that much more frequent. You can just feel trust in the system generally eroding. There's not the trust in the system that there was 50 or 100 years ago. And that's a good time to own, the asset that you should own when trust is low.
I've been at these conferences for a while at Deutsche Goldmesse. I have to say there's been kind of a feeling of gold versus Bitcoin. We could see our mining stock, our junior stock, being going higher if there wasn't so much interest happening over with this Bitcoin thing. You said, though, that you can hold both Bitcoin and gold as well, too. Explain that.
I really like Bitcoin. I wrote what's generally perceived to be the first book on Bitcoin from a recognized publisher back in 2014, Bitcoin, the Future of Money. And I think Bitcoin is a fantastic technological breakthrough. And just by owning Bitcoin, you're kind of investing in all the people that are involved in the Bitcoin space. It's like owning shares in the network. And I think everyone should have an allocation to both. But when I started going to Bitcoin conferences, what I noticed was I'd be the oldest person at a Bitcoin conference. This is 2010, 2011, 2012. But I'd be the youngest person at a gold conference. And there's a real generational divide between gold and Bitcoin. And I'm now 53, and I sort of think I'm on the sort of cusp of the divide. Where Bitcoin has been brilliant is it has been proved the most fantastic educational tool. It has educated people about fiat money and the nature of money and so on in a way that, a lot of gold pugs used to do. But, when I used to write articles and I'd say the word fiat 15 years ago, I'd always have to define what I meant by fiat. I no longer have to do that. And so Bitcoin has been a wonderful tool from that regard. And we're in a world where so much value is digital. In fact, I think 98% of money is now digital. It's probably higher than that. Bonds, stocks, everything is digitally recorded. Tech companies reach much higher valuations than companies. Amazon has a higher valuation than Walmart, for example. IP, intellectual property, copyright, trademarks, so much value is now digital. And money itself is technology, and money is almost like money evolves as technology evolves. And now we have this incredible speed of communication, and money, billions of dollars of value are trading hands every second because just, internet communications and so on. So money is like a communication tool. And in all of this, gold is the most analog asset there is. It is the most analog, it's an analog asset in a digital world. And yet Bitcoin, doesn't have the beauty of gold unless you're a mathematician who appreciates the beauty of code, in which case you could argue that it does have beauty to it, but it's basically, Satoshi Nakamoto described it as a dull asset. It doesn't have the beauty or the captivation or the allure of gold, but it performs many similar functions to gold, but in the digital world. So one is an analog asset and one is a digital asset. And gold is the creation of Mother Nature. And Mother Nature has created this incredible substance. And Bitcoin is a brilliant technological breakthrough, which as an open source, it had the original input of Satoshi Nakamoto and all the cypherpunks. But then loads and loads of people have contributed to Bitcoin, each in their own different way. But as I say, one is an analog asset and one is a digital asset. And I recommend you own both. I do agree that the speculative anti-fiat money a lot of it has gone over to crypto, and that might have once upon a time gone into gold. But I just think crypto is for the under 50s and gold is for the over 50s. They're almost two different markets.
When I did this conference a year ago, we just had about the breakout of the Ukraine-Russia war, and I was sitting down with Matthew Piepenburg with Matterhorn, and we were talking. He was talking at the time about the worries of just at that time. One of the first sanctions that were levied against Russia was financial controls, freezing of assets. At that point, Matthew at that time was warning about. This is going to be leading to an escalation of de-dollarisation. I was looking at one of your recent commentaries, and you're talking that de-dollarisation is something, though, that has really kind of come to the fore in the last couple of months, and most recently as well, too. What is causing that right now? It seems to be more about what you're talking again about, kind of the worries about the financial system?
Well, it's a very interesting subject, and de-dollarisation as a narrative is very interesting. In the bull market that gold experienced between 2001 and 2011, the narrative was very much the collapse of the US dollar. That was a really strong narrative. And in 2008, it looked like for a moment like it might actually be happening. But the US dollar never collapsed. Sure, it's lost 10, 5, even 15% of its purchasing power every year, so that, a US dollar today probably buys you less than half what it bought you 20 years ago. In 2003, probably buys you half as much house, half as much S&P 500, half as much food. So a 50% fall in 20 years, maybe that is a collapse, but it's not. It's an incremental, gradual decline. But in any case, talking about the collapse of the US dollar was probably too extreme a narrative for it to really enter the mainstream media. It was more a sort of alternative narrative. But what you notice with de-dollarisation, it's subtly different. The outcome may be the same, but it's subtly different. And so what I've noticed with de-dollarisation is you have, President Macron came back from China 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he was talking about de-dollarisation. Elon Musk was talking about it. Tucker Carlson was talking about it on one of his final monologues on Fox News. You're reading about it in mainstream newspapers. It's a much more viable narrative, de-dollarisation, than the collapse of the US dollar, if you like. Now, another thing to bear in mind is we have the emergence of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, I think it's 40% of the world's population would be this sort of trading bloc that maybe starts with Turkey in the west, China in the east, Russia to the north, India to the south, and pretty much everything in between. 20% of world GDP. It's enormous. It's like 60% of Eurasia, something like that, just enormous in terms of landmass. And most of those countries are not great friends of the US. They're not necessarily enemies of the US, but they're not great friends of the US in the way that, say, Britain or Canada is. And most of those countries would rather not use the US dollar to settle trade between themselves if they could. The problem is many of the countries in that Shanghai Cooperation Organization are not necessarily the most trustworthy, let's say. A lot of the regimes are a little bit dodgy. And even though they might not like to use the US dollar, they don't entirely trust each other either. And so when push comes to shove, a lot of the time they trust America and the US dollar more than they trust each other. So they continue to use SWIFT and the dollarization and so on. But if America is weaponizing its finance in the way that it throws Russia out of the financial system, and in a way I don't blame the US for doing that, it kind of made practical sense at the time, but it's going to accelerate the move out of the US dollar. And whenever they have trade summits, they have this thing called the St. Petersburg International Forum, which is like the Russian Davos every year, and they have summits and so on. It keeps coming up, this subject of what can we use for international trade instead of the US dollar. You have China, meanwhile. Now, if you're to sum up, what is China's ambition? It is to retain, it's to be top dog in the world. It's to go back to its rightful place at the top of the world. It's been the dominant economy in the world before, and I think it wants to be again. And part of that is to have the global reserve currency. Now, I've made great arguments, and I've audited the amount of gold that China's produced, the amount of gold that China's imported, and I make the argument that China's gold holdings are probably between 8 and 10 times what they say they are, official gold holdings. In other words, they're probably bigger than those of America. But China, for the moment, is still going by the doctrine, we must not shine too brightly. But it is starting to settle trade with Brazil, with Argentina, with Saudi Arabia. Central commodities is starting to settle in renminbi, in the yuan. So it's gradually moving. It's not a sudden thing. But if China wanted to weaponize finance in a way that America did against Russia, China could just declare its gold holdings and back the yuan with gold. And suddenly America would be forced to do something different. And then we would discover how much gold America really has. But I don't think China's quite ready to do that. But if China wanted to weaponize finance in the way that the States has done, and also China's not going to do that while it's got $3 trillion of US debt or whatever. I think it's got $3 trillion of US debt and another $1 trillion of US dollar, whatever the number is. But those numbers have come off. They're sort of 5-10% lower than they were a year ago. So it's just a gradual thing. But so it's, again, we're looking at this sort of incremental process rather than a sudden overnight thing. But, the expression is gradually, then suddenly. But at the moment, we're still in the gradual phase. But in all of this, that original premise that we started this conversation with, put 5 or 10% of your net worth in gold and hope it doesn't go up. The case for that in all these geopolitics, and we all speculate about geopolitics, nobody quite knows what's going on. But in all of that, the case to have some gold, money outside of the system, money that keeps its purchasing power forever, something that cannot be destroyed by anyone, the case to have some of that in your portfolio is very strong.
Lastly, Dominic, you're lucky. This is the first week of May. I'm going to give you a choice question, and what is the most interesting thing out there? If you're gold inclined, you just have a feast that you can sit your teeth into right now. You have the fiscal cliff that's coming up. You have the themes around de-dollarization. You have potential recession outlook that is happening. You have the high debt levels. You have the choice that the Fed chair has got to make. And I'm sure there's a couple of other things that I've missed going down the list. You're lucky because you're a commentator and then you have to produce your Substack. So you have a number of choices and subjects that you can choose upon. What is the most interesting? What is the most consequential out there right now, Dominic?
I'm going to say artificial intelligence, AI. These new it's really weird. We've got this sort of two-tier process going on where we have government, whether it's the US government or the UK government, and all its bodies, all the government departments and so on. We call it the state in the UK, but in the US they call it government. but whatever word you want to use, it just seems to be increasingly ineffectual, increasingly expensive, increasingly invasive, increasingly incompetent, increasingly wasteful. Its money gets worse and worse each year. So you've got this sort of trend, its taxes get higher, all these things. You've got this sort of one trend, but at the same time, you know, mankind is getting more and more brilliant, more and more inventive. And, you know, I'm one of these people, I've started using ChatGPT and I use Midjourney AI art, and I use them both all the time. And I don't use it to do my writing, but I use it to do my heavy lifting after I've done the writing. So I use it to cite all my references, to write my tags, to write my SEO explanations. You know what I mean? All that sort of boring stuff. And it's just made my Substack so much better. And you know, Egon von Greyerz saw my presentation earlier today, and he just said, "Who did your slides? Your art is amazing. Those pictures are beautiful." I did them in like 5 seconds on Midjourney. And listen, you know, I'm 53, I'm a Gen Xer. There are people who are using AI who actually are good with computers, who are just, it's so transformative. I think it's almost as big as the internet was. It's that huge. And so on the one hand, we've got this, you know, huge technical revolution. It's going to be maybe not quite on the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but you could say the digital revolution, which includes the internet, cryptocurrencies, AI, you know, 3D printing, whatever. All of that put together, the digital revolution is as big as the Industrial Revolution was. And all of that is making us so much more productive. And therefore, it's going to make our lives much better because, you know, we won't need to do the crappy jobs anymore because we're going to get robots to do it for us. So we've got that theme of improvement and progress, along with this ever declining trend of ever more rubbish government. And you sort of got these two trends together, and I just think they sort of mumble and stumble along. But I think we're eventually going into a world where some people are going to be trapped in the fiat economy, some are going to be trapped in their own fiat, in their own physical economy. And then there are others who are just going to be in the digital economy, digital nomads, you know, a bit like Google and Starbucks, all these international globalized corporations. I think we're just going to see international globalized individuals as well. And tech is making it possible. So we're going to be, it's sort of going to get worse and better at the same time, if that makes sense. And people look at if you imagine the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the government, the state was about 10% of GDP. And if you take taxation as a measure of freedom, which it is, how much of your own labour do you own? You know, 10%, we were pretty free in 1900. And many people will look back to that time and go, it was a wonderful time, you could get through life, you could barely notice the existence of the state. But at the same time, we barely, I don't even know if the plane had been invented, cars, the mobile phone, communications, all these things, they just either didn't exist or they barely existed. But they all exist now. So even though government is more of a force of repression, technology is at the same time incredibly liberating. So we might not be as free as we were in terms of regulation and tax, but we're freer than we've ever been in terms of what's possible. I can go anywhere in the world quicker than I've ever gone. I can do more amazing things. I could probably even go to space if I wanted to, if I had enough money, if my gold goes up. But so I think you understand what I'm saying. We've got these two incredible trends, and I'm very excited about the potential of AI. I recognise that we might have unleashed the Kraken, something uncontrollable, but at the moment I'm using it and it's making the quality of my work better and requiring less input from me. And I'm sure if my experience is anything to go by, millions of other people are finding the same thing, and millions of other companies are finding the same thing. So I'm very excited about the potential of AI.
Dominic, if you go to space, tip, don't bring your gold with you because that'll probably make the flight more expensive.
It will, because of the weight. But you know, but gold is used by like mad in spacecraft. They use it to line, to protect your visors and all the rest of it. So it might be useful.
Dominic,
I wouldn't be able to say, here's an interesting thing. Let's say we colonize space and you wanted to send money from Mars to Jupiter. You could probably send Bitcoin, but you couldn't send gold. You'd have to send a spacecraft to take the gold over. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. And the space object that's furthest away from Earth is onto the, I can't remember the name of the spacecraft again.
Oh yeah. The space object that's furthest away from Earth is the gold standard.
Yeah. Dominic, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
My name is Michael McCrae here at Deutsche Goldmesse for Kitco Mining.
Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Defiance Silver.